All right. Welcome back. Welcome to episode 12 of A Day with Dre. To be honest, I didn't think I would make it this deep, but here we are. And again, so let's keep this thing going. So before we get started, please make sure you like, subscribe, share A Day with Dre podcast wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, YouTube. Again, anywhere you get your podcast, please share, like, subscribe, leave a comment. A Day with Dre. Also, little short clips available on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, really wherever you ingest your media. I'll try to make sure I have a presence there. So let's get to it. All right, where are we at? Again, it's the beginning of March. All right, Black History Month is over. So what are we going to get into now? How are we doing? I mentioned in the fall that I was going to take a particular interest to mental health. So let's get back to those topics. Okay, let's talk about us. One of the things I really wanted to talk about today is what is mental illness? Because I think what gets the majority of the attention when we talk about mental illness is depression and anxiety. And not to minimize those things, but there is more to mental illness. How is it received in our society, right? How it's received by me might be different than how it's received by you. You know, the culture I come from, the Black American culture, might look at some things differently than maybe some of the people that are listening to this. I think in general in America, we don't do a good enough job at thinking about mental illness, or maybe sometimes we chalk everything up to mental illness, and because it's easy sometimes, and then other times when we need to have those conversations, it's hard. But I want to primarily focus on my experience with it, my upbringing in the 90s in a majority Black population, and how mental illness is received there. My own personal experience with not just mental illness, but I guess any neurodivergence, which just means not your typical brained person. So whether that's dealing with ADHD, anything that's, I guess, not quote unquote normal falls into that category. From that to mental illness, how was that received by my family? How did my family perpetuate some of those things? How did they deal with those things on their own? Because especially in my family, I think it's important we talk about, or people with similar families to mine. My family were descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, therefore lived through Jim Crow, segregation, etc. How did they navigate those things? And did it have a generational traumatic impact on my family? And how do we escape that generational trauma? How is it affecting people today? Because of course your goal of your parents is to set you up better than they were, but there are certain things that maybe they don't realize they need to address. Let's talk about all of that type of stuff today. And I'll give a firsthand experience of how I've seen those things impact my family. And again, just for a recap of what I want to talk about, I want to talk about generational trauma and mental illness and how that affects people over time and in the current, and really just how, I guess, my family can be a representation of some of the Black American experience and people that are maybe going through something that we can't exactly see. And most importantly, what are we willing to do to make these things better as an individual, as a culture, and honestly, as a country? So moving on, what is generational trauma? Okay, so generational trauma is basically how traumatic experiences from one generation have been transmitted to the next. So like I mentioned, I'm a descendant of the transatlantic slave trade here in the States. So as you can imagine, that's a pretty big trauma for people to go through. Of course, generations upon generations of not being treated as human, being treated as property, people being sold, raped, whipped, just being treated as less than human for hundreds of years. And then you go from that into the Reconstruction and segregation / Jim Crow South before my family moved north. And then moving north, there was still a special set of issues that were encountered up north. So how are these things transferred from generation to generation? When you're constantly in like a fight or flight mode, just simply because of the way you look, and then that gets passed on to your children, and then they pass that on to their children, and the cycle keeps going. And even, I grew up in the 90s. I have young parents. In the 80s, you had the war on drugs. My dad grew up in an inner city. He had to deal with, mass incarceration, trying to navigate that world, which was still obviously disproportionately affecting Black people, Black men specifically, painted to be criminals, thugs, things like that. How do these things keep getting passed down? My dad might talk about the world in a certain way because of how his world was shaped. Growing up in broken homes, both of my parents had to deal with that. Their parents had to deal with that. Their parents before them had to deal with that. And then before that, they weren't even legally allowed to have like a formal family unit. So how are all of these things affecting my generation, people that at my age that have kids? How are all these things affecting them today? And there's different ways that generational trauma works, right? Okay, of course you have direct exposure. You have your parents or your grandparents that lived through traumatic events. One of my grandparents has a sibling that was lynched. That's something that they might not ever get over. And that fear causes them to pass that fear along to their children. Their children pass that fear along to me, etc. So then that leads to learning behaviors that might not be good, but thought to be necessary for survival. There's data that says that can change the epigenetics, so that trauma alters gene expression. And then, of course, emotional learned behaviors that come from that. So this, again, can affect families in all types of different ways. That can, of course, lead to mental health issues, right? Generational trauma being passed down can lead to mental health issues. You can lead to anxiety, depression, PTSD, substance abuse. A lot of these things that we don't actually talk about. I think as a country, we talk about these things, but we don't talk about these things in the Black community as much as we need to. Just simply being Black, and especially in an inner city setting, the anxiety, depression, PTSD, substance abuse runs rampant. Okay. I don't want to offend anybody, but if you need to drink something or need to smoke something every day just to get your day going or just to end your day, guess what? That's substance abuse. Substance abuse exists for a reason. Why do you need to use those substances to go to bed, to get out of bed? All right, let's try to get to the bottom of some of these things. Let's talk about some of these things. Physical health problems, chronic stress leads to heart disease, leads to immune system dysfunction, right? Why do Black people on average die earlier? Okay. Relationship difficulties. It's getting a lot better, but there's still a problem with having proper relationships in a lot of the Black community. And it's not simply just because you're right. It's not because you're Black, but it might be a cultural thing, right? People coming from broken homes, wanting better for themselves, but not knowing how to get better because maybe they've never seen better, right? And then it can lead to cycles of violence. You're stuck in these situations. Of course, there's all types of influences on why these traumas exist, because some of it's generational, some of it's still current. We can talk about systemic reasons, and then having dysfunctional coping mechanisms, such as avoiding talking about some of these issues. Again, going back to maybe some of the substance abuses, that's avoiding your reality, disassociating yourself from your reality. You think about a lot of the music that I glorify myself. You can sing a song about sliding on somebody and not even realize like you're talking about humans, right? We're glorifying music that is celebrating killing other people, stuff like that. So again, this isn't like to point fingers at anybody, but these are just examples of maybe some of the issues we have that can be related to some of these generational traumatic issues that lead into mental health issues. But we're so disassociated from, having feelings, and we separate ourselves from being loving and caring unless, we should love everybody in our community. It doesn't matter what part of the community they're from, but instead we're allowed to love people that are, only related to us, and we don't even do that properly. And again, of course, if the shoe doesn't fit, then don't get offended by that. I'm just making generalizations, and the system that made us this way is probably not going to be fixed. So what do we do within that system? How can we try to make it better? Because we can't rely on anybody else to make it better for us. That's really the point. That's the space I'm coming from. If they're not going to make it better, the people that put us in this situation to have all this generational trauma, and some of it, you got to own it yourself too. We have to own some of this ourselves, but we didn't place ourselves in the barrel, right? But just because we're all in the barrel doesn't mean we need to keep pinching each other. But just because people put you in a bad situation doesn't mean you need to contribute to the bad situation. But of course, you shouldn't have been put in the bad situation in the first place. So for me personally, how do I get through some of these things? I grew up in a quote unquote broken home. had teenage parents that had no business being together. Never saw my parents happily love each other. It's a lot of fighting, a lot of pettiness both ways, physically hurting each other, emotionally hurting each other. And then on top of that, I was born into the world with some developmental learning disabilities. All right. I looked at one of my old charts the other day. Thanks to my chart, you can do that. And one of my visits with the pediatrician at some point when I was a toddler said that I had restricted interests. They noticed that I had abnormally repetitive behaviors. I wasn't the greatest at sensory processing unless there was a certain sensory thing that I liked. I either rejected a lot of sensory things or was obsessed with some sensory things, wouldn't make eye contact when they were trying to talk to me, etc. I'm not going to diagnose myself, but there's a word we use for people with symptoms like that now. But again, this isn't about that, so I'll leave that alone. We can talk about that another time. But my family, again, mom and dad both came from broken homes. Their parents, they had dysfunctional relationships with their parents. That doesn't mean that their parents didn't love them, but they both talk about how, they used to get their asses whipped. Parents were very strict. They didn't grow up with both parents in the home, weren't maybe protected in the way they should have been protected, but they just had to figure out the world. And they wanted better for us, but also they didn't try and have kids. They didn't stay together very long. They weren't meant to have kids together. Me and my siblings behind the ball, because like I said, I had teenage parents and I'm not even the oldest child. So, they put themselves behind the ball. And what that did was that made what they wanted to prevent for themselves and their children, they actually ended up recreating, because they created another broken home, and we had to watch stuff that kids had no business seeing. Or we get left in the house, no babysitters, nothing like that. Just be like, y'all, you're 8 now. You should be able to stay at home overnight by yourself. You got a big brother. He's 10. Y'all should be good. You don't need anybody over here. And thankfully we were okay. But, without that supervision, we got into some shit that we didn't need to be getting into. We're doing we're kids. We're a bunch of little boys. We were, curious, and we ended up doing stupid stuff all the time. Thankfully, not stupid enough where anybody got severely hurt or worse. But I used to think that was normal. And then when I got older, and especially when I went out to a suburban high school and I started talking to people about, they were having babysitters until they were damn near almost a teenager and had such structured environments. But even if their parents weren't together, even if their parents hated each other, they didn't see their parents cuss each other out. They didn't see, their mom try to backdoor their dad. Parents fight each other, literally fight each other. All these things that I thought was normal, and these things that were actually shaping the way that I viewed relationships, because I'm a socially awkward little boy and I'm just going to start mimicking the stuff that I see my parents doing. These other kids weren't dealing with stuff like that. And, and then all of a sudden the thing that my parents talked about wanting to prevent, they created again. And then they just say, well, don't be like us. Well, that's easier said than done when this is all you're seeing. So how do we, that's my story. I'm sure there's millions of other people that have that same experience. They unintentionally recreated what they went through when they were kids and made us go through it when we were kids. And you don't realize how much that might affect you until you get older. I got a little bit older, started going through some things. I think separated myself from that environment and realized that, especially when I started getting into romantic relationships or attempting to, realize how emotionally suppressed I was because I was in such a chaotic environment growing up. And I might have, based on what my, evaluations of me when I was a kid, I might have had a predisposition to being emotionally repressed, except for sometimes then I had emotional explosions or whatever. But I think the chaotic environment, I grew up in a place where I knew my parents loved me, but it wasn't expressed. It wasn't said. When I was a kid, I wasn't getting hugs from my parents. They wasn't, what did you learn at school today? It wasn't anything like that. We didn't have, there was a photo album here and there, but it's not like we had pictures of, first grade here. Like that stuff existed in my family. Of course, grandma had pictures. Not saying my mom didn't have anything, but like it wasn't like an open, expressive, loving environment because my parents were babies and babies shouldn't be raising babies. And then they also grew up with parents that were babies raising babies. So again, these cycles that kept happening over and over and over again. And I think people either repeat that or they do the exact opposite. So I had teenage parents. I'm 30, never been married, don't have kids, and didn't even think that, it wasn't until I started going to counseling therapy myself that I had some unresolved things from my childhood, right, that kept me from wanting to pursue some of those things. And I used to just chalk it up to, well, I'm just focusing on my career. I got to finish med school. I got to finish residency. And then I realized that those actually aren't the reasons that I was waiting. It was simply because I didn't want to possibly recreate this thing because that's all I knew. That's quite literally all I knew. And it took talking to people that understood that, because I tried therapy before. They didn't understand the kind of issues that I went through. So I had to find therapists that understood my social background and upbringing a little more than, and not that I had white men, white women, not that they weren't knowledgeable. I just wanted someone that could actually feel and relate to some of the pressures, and also, talk to me in a way that I felt was authentic and real and caring, but in a way that I understood and felt. And I think that's probably one of the things that is missing for my demographic in particular, is having the people that you can talk to that actually maybe can relate. Even if they can't relate, they understand. Because I'm sorry, like a white woman's just not going to understand to the depth that I need them to feel comfortable, at least. Some of the things that I had lived through, continue to go through. So again, and we appreciate everybody that's committed to helping the mental health of others, right? But sometimes people are just better matches for certain types of people. But I realized that growing up, right, and into my adulthood, I was extremely emotionally suppressed. And there were only certain instances where I felt like I could truly open up. And that really, looking at it now, it really, unfortunately, it negatively affected how I connected with friends, because I have a very small group of friends. And I felt like they still don't maybe get the love and the support from me that they deserve. It damn sure wrecked romantic relationships, because on one, I already have an issue connecting to people and feeling vulnerable, because I grew up in a house where I couldn't even be that way. And then on top of that, just for societal, it's lame to love your girl. I think that's the dumbest shit I've ever heard of. Like, so for all of you, like anybody that hears this, it doesn't matter what your friends say or what people say. Like, if you love someone, if you like someone, like, it's okay to be sprung over that person. Like, fuck all the other bullshit about, like, playing it cool or whatever. And if you end up looking dumb in the end, what's the point of being all reserved, being too cool? You not to be like cliche or cringy or anything like that. And if you feel like you're not able to do that, if you feel like you can't connect in that kind of way, then that's where I'm going to plug maybe talking to someone, because you should be capable of doing that. And that's really that was my wake up alarm, because I failed people that I knew I loved them. I know they loved me, but for some reason, I just didn't know how to connect in the way that I should have. From the time that was put in, I felt like I was failing them. And talking to people, talking to therapists, kind of trying to get to the root of these problems, because that's honestly what started this for me. I went through some personal loss, lost relationships with people that I had no business losing a relationship with. And then in therapy and in reflection, realizing that I was nowhere near the person I should have been for them. And part of it was I didn't know how to be, because I was just out here freestyling. Second part was possibly I was just shown all these bad examples of how to be in a relationship. So I didn't want to do that, but I also didn't want to be out here vulnerable, because I was never able to be vulnerable my whole life. And that made me lose people that, maybe were the person for me or something like that. So long story short, we all suffer we have these familial curses or generational traumas, and it affects how we, even if you might not even realize that it does affect how you act. Me and my siblings, we love each other to death, but I think our upbringing has really fractured how maybe we need to interact with each other, because we love each other. Our parents loved us, but we didn't grow up in a house of love. And that makes sense if you live through that. For some of you, you can't quite comprehend what that even means and how that makes sense. And that's a blessing. But there's some of you that can relate to that. And my whole life, because again, I'm just going to base this off of what I went through. My experience was, doesn't matter. I'm good. I'm good. I got to college on a scholarship. I'm good. Nothing was going to stop me. And then sitting, talking to a professional about some of these things. And next thing I know, we're talking about how in college, going to all these sporting events and not having anybody there to support you, being the first person to get your bachelor's, your master's, your doctorate, and not having both your parents there to welcome you, not having, and I appreciate every time they could come to something, but it wasn't like it was a money issue or anything like that. Sometimes they just didn't come, from the sporting events to graduations to everything, like them not being there. I used to think that it didn't bother me. And then all of a sudden, some traumatic event happens, dog dies, etc. And then I can't regulate any emotions in any type of way. And I'm crying for the first time in years, but it's not just the fact that Jackson died. It's all these different things just all coming together. And sometimes the hard thing about therapy is you got to talk through those things. You have to relive some of those things, but also understand why you're feeling those things, or at least attempt to get to the bottom of those things. And honestly, although it's disappointing to see how I was living and how maybe I closed people off and pushed people away, on one hand, it's like, well, now I'm a little too self-aware. But then on the other hand, it makes me feel like, okay, now I'm going to be able to maybe relate to people and be the person that those people deserve. And, it's unfortunate that you, or at least me personally, maybe I've lost some great people or burned some bridges with people because I wasn't who I needed to be at the time for them. But at least I know I'm working towards being everything I deserve for myself and for other people. So really, yeah, this whole episode was just a plug on my personal journey, how I've, because I know if I've gone through this, then even if there's one other person that's gone through the same thing, that, there is help out there. And it's better to feel things and feel the entire spectrum of being human than to become numb to the world. Because I thought I was living great when I was numb to the world, until something happened that made it so I had no choice but to pull all of those things to the light. And then I realized I was living bad. I was living terribly. So with that being said, if you had to take one thing away from all this, is get a damn therapist, get a counselor, talk to someone. Even if that means opening up to people that aren't professionals, but, get your feet wet, start moving and getting more comfortable talking about things that, talk about shit that you're scared of, talk about things that maybe hurt. And then that'll be the first step in, you're holding on to this anxiety, you're holding on to these depressive things. And maybe that's what you need to, start repairing relationships with, your family, with your parents, whatever. Learn how to love them all over again in a healthier way, and not just because they're the people that put you on this planet. And I think that'll feel like the cloud over you is starting to go away, because what I have learned is it's the way this world is. It's hard to feel like you need to hold everything on your shoulders. And again, this is not me just giving advice. This is me looking in the mirror as well. And you are better off letting some people in, and you'll become better at letting people in when you start talking to someone about some of the issues that you have yourself. So yeah, like I said in a few episodes ago, like we need to learn how to love each other again. But the first step in doing that is knowing how to love yourself. So that's where I'll end for tonight. This is honestly, this is almost like a open journal to myself, but in the spirit of being transparent, I'm letting you all into my world. So appreciate y'all for listening, and have a good night.